Andre Wells sat in his small, cozy living room, frustration settling over him like a thick fog. His Wi-Fi connection had been on the fritz for the past hour, and it seemed like no matter what he did, the connection wouldn't stabilize. His favorite playlist was stuck on repeat, and the video he was trying to watch buffered endlessly. With a sigh, he reached for his phone and navigated to the Wi-Fi settings. "Okay, let's try this again," Andre muttered to himself, tapping the screen to change the network password. The routine task was supposed to be simple, something he'd done countless times before. A fresh password usually did the trick, resetting the connection and smoothing over any glitches. But this time, it felt different. There was an edge to the frustration he couldn't quite place. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating for a moment. He'd recently moved into the neighborhood, and though it seemed quiet, there were still moments when he noticed little things, like the way some of his neighbors watched him, or the odd feeling he had when walking past certain houses. It wasn't anything overt, but the subtle looks, the hushed voices when he passed, made him feel like an outsider. Shaking off the thoughts, Andre entered a new password and hit save. The change was instantaneous, and as the router blinked to life, the connection stabilized. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. That was easier than he'd expected. He leaned back into his chair, content for the first time in hours, his fingers scrolling aimlessly through his phone. But just as he was about to open his latest news feed, the sound of knocking at his door made him jump. Andre frowned. It was just past noon, and he hadn't been expecting anyone. He stood up slowly, a sense of unease creeping over him. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting any deliveries, and his friends had no reason to visit today. As he approached the door, he peeked through the peephole. Standing on the other side was Officer Jake Collins, his uniform a stark contrast to the white-painted doorframe. He wasn't alone. Behind him, two other officers were standing, looking slightly out of place, almost as if they were waiting for something. But what? "Mr. Wells," Officer Collins called, his voice calm yet firm. Andre opened the door cautiously, offering a polite smile, though confusion clouded his mind. "Yes? Can I help you?" The officer took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room behind Andre before returning to him. "We've received a report from one of your neighbors. They're concerned about suspicious activity, and we need to ask you a few questions." Andre's stomach dropped, his mind racing through possibilities. Suspicious activity? What kind of activity? Collins raised an eyebrow, the calmness of his voice not matching the tension in the air. "We're just here to clear things up. Your neighbor, Jessica Harris, mentioned something about changes in your Wi-Fi network. She found it unusual, and we want to make sure everything is all right." Andre blinked, his confusion growing. "My Wi-Fi network?" he repeated. "I don't understand. It's just a simple password change. It wasn't anything special." The officer nodded, as if that explanation should have been enough. "We understand, but we need to check a few things, Mr. Wells, just to make sure everything is in order." Before Andre could ask any more questions, the two other officers stepped inside, bypassing him without another word. One of them walked to the small desk in the corner, where Andre had left his laptop open, displaying a list of active devices on the network. The other officer looked at the doorframe, inspecting it as if looking for any signs of forced entry. "This is a bit unnecessary, don't you think?" Andre finally managed to say, his patience starting to wear thin. "I've done nothing wrong. This is ridiculous." Officer Collins turned to face him. "We're just doing our job, Mr. Wells. Your neighbor was concerned, and it's our responsibility to investigate. I'm sure you understand." Andre's heart was pounding now. This had to be some kind of mistake. Jessica had always seemed so friendly when they spoke, albeit with a coldness that he never fully understood. Why would she be making a big deal out of something as simple as a Wi-Fi password change? Jessica Harris. He could almost see her face now, her serious expression, always watching from across the street. Andre had assumed it was just his imagination, the way she seemed to be monitoring everything around her. But now, as the officers poked around his apartment, it felt like his suspicions were turning into reality. She had reported him. And for what? Changing his Wi-Fi password? "I don't understand," Andre said, his voice rising. "You're here because of a Wi-Fi password? That's what this is about? You know, I think you should talk to my neighbor, not me." Officer Collins nodded slowly, his eyes scanning Andre's face, as if assessing the situation. "We'll need to speak to your neighbor, of course. But right now, we have a protocol to follow. We need to make sure everything's all right in the neighborhood." Andre crossed his arms, stepping back into the living room as the officers continued their inspection. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle in front of him. Why was Jessica so concerned? What had she seen or heard that had led her to this conclusion? Had she been watching him? Or was it just her own paranoia? Before he could think too much about it, the sound of a tapping key on the keyboard interrupted his thoughts. One of the officers had pulled up a new screen on his laptop, his expression growing more serious by the second. Officer Collins, the officer said, his voice lower than before. You might want to see this. Officer Collins stepped forward, looking over the officer's shoulder. Andre could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something had just changed, and whatever was happening next, it wasn't going to be simple. The tension in the room thickened as Officer Collins and the other officers huddled around the laptop. Andre, still standing by the door, felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He tried to keep calm, but the strange unfolding of events made it harder by the second. His mind was racing. What was this about? What could they possibly be looking at? Officer, Andre asked, his voice shaky, but laced with confusion. What's going on? What are you seeing? Officer Collins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing. The officer who had been inspecting Andre's laptop glanced over at Collins, his face reflecting concern. It's not just his network, sir. The officer finally spoke, his voice sounding distant. It's the whole neighborhood. Andre felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Officer Collins motioned for Andre to come closer. Come take a look at this. Reluctantly, Andre stepped forward and glanced over the officer's shoulder at the screen. The laptop was displaying a list of IP addresses, but what caught his eye were the numerous lines marked connected. Some of them were linked to homes in his neighborhood, including Jessica Harris's address. The officer pointed to one of the entries. This is your network. But these others, he paused. These other devices, they seem to be pulling security feeds from various homes around here. Andre's stomach dropped. Wait, you're saying someone's been watching the cameras in our neighborhood? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could this be happening? Exactly, Collins replied, his voice flat, but his expression was serious. We're trying to figure out if the camera feeds were hacked or if someone had access to the networks without permission. It looks like the cameras have been monitored from various locations, including your home. Andre shook his head in disbelief. No way. I have no idea what this is. I just changed my Wi-Fi password. That's it. The officer, still seated at the desk, pulled up another window on the laptop. He scrolled through some files, his eyes scanning the screen carefully. It's not just your Wi-Fi, Andre. These addresses here, he pointed to the list, they all have connections to live surveillance feeds. Someone has been watching this neighborhood through the security cameras. Andre stared at the list, his breath catching in his throat. Was this why Jessica had called the police? Was it because of these security feeds? And if so, why hadn't anyone else noticed? But I didn't do this. I have no idea what you're talking about, Andre said, his frustration mounting. His palms began to sweat. I just moved here. I barely know anyone. You have to believe me. Officer Collins held up a hand, signaling for Andre to calm down. We're not accusing you of anything yet. But right now, we need to figure out who else has had access to this data. And how. The air felt thick with the weight of the investigation, but before Andre could ask any more questions, the doorbell rang. He turned quickly, confusion written all over his face. Who else could it be at this point? Officer Collins held up a hand again, signaling for Andre to stay put as he moved toward the door. I'll handle it, he said, stepping out of the room. The two officers who had been inspecting the laptop exchanged glances. Their faces remained stoic, but there was something in their eyes that seemed to say they didn't fully believe Andre's innocence yet. The tension was palpable. From the hallway, Andre heard voices, soft at first, then clearer as they approached. Officer Collins stepped back into the living room, followed by none other than Jessica Harris, his neighbor. She stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Jessica, Andre said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Jessica's eyes flicked nervously between Andre and the officers, and she took a hesitant step forward. She looked disoriented, but there was also a hint of guilt in her expression. I had to come. I didn't know what else to do, she said, her voice trembling. She was shaking, her hands wringing together as she spoke. I thought something was wrong. I thought I was helping by calling the police. I didn't know it would turn into this. Andre stared at her, his mouth dry. What exactly did you think was happening, Jessica? I'm just trying to fix my Wi-Fi. Jessica opened her mouth to respond but then closed it, her face flushing. The reality of the situation seemed to be hitting her now, the enormity of what she had done sinking in. Why did you call the police? Andre asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't understand. Why accuse me of something like this? Jessica looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I thought you were. I don't know, hiding something. I saw your Wi-Fi name change, and I got suspicious. There were things happening in the neighborhood, noises, things seemed off. And when I saw your network name change, she trailed off, unable to continue. Officer Collins stepped forward, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder, though his expression remained neutral. Ms. Harris, we understand your concern. But jumping to conclusions like this, it's caused a lot of confusion. You have to be careful with accusations, especially when they involve something as serious as police involvement. Jessica nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't mean to make things worse. I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing. The officers exchanged looks, but none of them said anything for a moment. Andre stood still, processing everything Jessica had just said. He couldn't believe that his simple Wi-Fi change had triggered all of this. That one small action had brought him to the center of a police investigation and made his life spiral out of control. But what was truly terrifying was the discovery about the surveillance feeds and the knowledge that someone in the neighborhood had been watching everyone's private lives. Just as Andre was about to speak, Officer Collins interrupted, his voice stern. We need to investigate this further, Ms. Harris. It's not just your concern. This is affecting the entire neighborhood. Andre could only nod, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. No one had expected things to escalate like this, and now the search for the person behind the cameras was beginning to take shape. But for Andre, the reality was just setting in. Someone in the neighborhood had been watching, and they were much closer than he'd realized. The room was tense, each person struggling to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Andre stood by the couch, his mind racing, while Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, unable to look at him. Officer Collins had gone back to the laptop, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as the other officers sifted through the digital files, their expressions becoming increasingly serious. We need to track down where these feeds are coming from, Officer Collins muttered under his breath, still focusing on the screen. If someone's been accessing security footage from people's homes, this is bigger than we thought. Andre could barely breathe. So, you're saying someone's been spying on us? On all of us? He struggled to keep his voice steady, the weight of the accusation making it hard to stay calm. Officer Collins nodded, not looking up from the screen. Yes. The system has been hijacked. These cameras were meant to be private, and now they're being monitored remotely. It's not just about Wi-Fi passwords or a routine network change. It's about something much darker. Andre's mind spun. All of this started because of a simple change in his Wi-Fi network name. How had it escalated so quickly? And why had Jessica, of all people, been the one to raise the alarm? She was right across the street, living in the same neighborhood. How did she not see what was happening? As Officer Collins continued to investigate the laptop, one of the other officers stood up, his voice shaking slightly. Sir, you need to see this. Collins turned around slowly, his face serious. The officer pointed at the screen, his finger hovering over a set of IP addresses. These are the locations where the feeds are being accessed. Andre stepped closer to get a better look. Those IPs are people's homes, right? The officer nodded. Yeah, several houses around the block. And these feeds? They go back months. Whoever's behind this has been watching for a while. Andre's heart skipped a beat. Could someone have been watching his home for that long? Could they have been using his Wi-Fi to infiltrate the system? The thought felt like a punch to the gut. Jessica, still sitting at the table, looked like she was in shock, barely able to process what was being said. Her gaze shifted between Andre and the officers. How is this even possible? How could someone do this without us noticing? Officer Collins glanced over at her, his voice calm but firm. It's possible because of poor security measures in place. Someone with the right skills could access those cameras, even through someone else's Wi-Fi network. Jessica's eyes widened. So, you're saying this has nothing to do with Andre? No, Collins said, shaking his head. It's not his fault. But he's caught in the middle of this because of his Wi-Fi network. The hacker likely used it as a bridge to access other homes. He's been an unwitting participant in this whole mess. Andre turned to Jessica, a surge of frustration welling up inside him. This is insane. I just moved here, Jessica. I barely know anyone, let alone have a reason to get involved in something like this. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. And you? You accused me of doing something wrong. You called the cops. You thought I was hiding something. Jessica flinched at his words, the sting of his accusation settling over her like a heavy weight. I didn't know what to think. I thought something was wrong when I saw the Wi-Fi change. And then the noises at night. I don't know. I thought it was you. I thought you were involved. Andre clenched his fists, trying to hold back the rising tide of anger. So instead of coming to me, you went straight to the cops? Jessica's voice faltered. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I thought I was protecting everyone here. There was a long pause before Andre spoke again, this time softer. By accusing me? By getting the cops involved without even knowing the full story. Her face flushed with embarrassment. I was wrong, she whispered, her eyes now meeting his. I can't even imagine how this must look. She stopped herself, her hands trembling in her lap. I'm sorry, Andre. Andre could feel the tension in the room dissolve a little, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed by Jessica or relieved that she was finally admitting the mistake. But the real problem remained. Someone in the neighborhood had been watching them all. And they still had no idea who that person was. Officer Collins, Andre said, his voice steady but urgent. How do we stop this? How do we figure out who's behind this? Collins looked at him and nodded. We're already working on it. But this is going to take some time. We need to track the IP addresses, cross-check with any surveillance footage from the neighborhood, and try to pinpoint who had access to the system. Andre nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The more they investigated, the more questions popped up. Who would do something like this? What could they want with private surveillance footage of an ordinary neighborhood? And most troubling of all, how far did this go? Was there anyone else in the neighborhood involved? Jessica, still reeling from her earlier misjudgment, stood up from the table. I need to talk to Brian. He might know something. He's been into tech stuff before. Maybe he can help. Andre shot her a look, but before he could say anything, Officer Collins spoke up. Jessica, I need you to stay here for a moment. We'll be in touch. We need to finish our investigation, and you're going to have to answer some more questions later. Jessica nodded, though there was a sense of helplessness in her movements. She had been so sure of herself earlier, but now the uncertainty was clear in her eyes. Andre watched as she sat back down, her hands clasped in front of her once again. The room was silent for a long time. The sound of the officers typing on the laptop was the only noise, but it felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of the unknown. The investigation had just begun, but the truth was starting to unravel. And Andre knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The silence in the room seemed unbearable, broken only by the sound of the officers working on their laptops and the occasional rustle of paper. Andre stood near the window, his thoughts racing as the investigation began to take shape. He couldn't help but feel like he was stuck in the middle of something much bigger than himself. A simple Wi-Fi password change had triggered all of this, turning his life upside down in a matter of hours. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, her gaze distant as she stared down at her hands. She looked like she was trying to make sense of everything, just like Andre was. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but there was something else, something Andre couldn't quite place. Was she hiding something? Officer Collins, Andre said, breaking the silence. What exactly are you looking for? You said you needed to trace the IP addresses, but what does that mean for us? For the neighborhood? Collins glanced up from his screen, his face grim. We're following the trail, Andre. If we can identify who's behind these security feeds, we'll know who's been watching. It's not just about who's been accessing your Wi-Fi. It's about the person who set all of this up in the first place. Andre nodded, his stomach tightening. The realization hit him again. This was bigger than he'd thought. He was a bystander in a much larger game, and someone in his neighborhood was playing with everyone's privacy. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again, interrupting his thoughts. He turned, expecting to see another officer or maybe someone else from the neighborhood. But when the door opened, it wasn't just anyone who stepped inside. It was Jessica's husband, Brian Harris. Brian. Jessica's voice cracked as she stood up quickly, her hand instinctively reaching out to him. He looked disheveled, his face tight with concern. His eyes flickered to the officers in the room, then to Andre, before landing on Jessica. What's going on? Why are there police in our house? Brian's voice was sharp, his jaw clenched. What happened? Jessica took a deep breath and gestured toward the officers. We have a problem, Brian. It's about the security cameras. The feeds, they've been hacked. Someone's been watching us. And, her voice trailed off, and she hesitated before looking at Andre. And, well? Andre's been caught up in it. Brian's eyes narrowed as he turned to Andre, and for the first time, Andre could see the tension in Brian's expression, an unreadable mix of confusion and suspicion. Caught up in it? What do you mean by that? Andre opened his mouth to explain, but before he could say anything, Officer Collins stepped forward. Mr. Harris, we need to speak with you. This investigation involves the security camera feeds that have been accessed from multiple homes in the neighborhood, including your own. Brian's eyes widened slightly, but his gaze didn't waver. What are you talking about? I haven't been involved in any security feeds. What the hell is going on here? Jessica looked back and forth between Andre and Brian, the realization finally dawning on her. Her voice faltered. Brian, I didn't know. I didn't know anything about the cameras. But we need to figure out who's been doing this. Who's been watching us? Brian stood frozen, his face going pale as the room seemed to close in around him. Jessica. I didn't think it was a big deal. Andre's confusion deepened. What do you mean you didn't think it was a big deal? Brian looked down at the floor for a moment, and then his gaze lifted again, guilt written across his face. I've been messing around with the network for a while. I know about tech stuff, and I thought I could. He stopped, his words caught in his throat as the truth began to unravel. You've been watching the feeds? Andre asked, his voice barely above a whisper, shock and disbelief creeping in. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Brian hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. I was curious, okay? I was testing the system. I wanted to see how easy it would be to access the feeds. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Jessica's face turned white, the blood draining from her features. You've been the one watching people's homes? Brian, how could you do that? Brian stepped back, his hands raised as if to ward off the accusations. I didn't think anyone would notice. It was all just an experiment, just testing how easy it would be to hack into things. I didn't mean to invade anyone's privacy. His voice cracked, a mixture of guilt and desperation pouring through his words. I didn't want to hurt anyone, I swear. I never thought it would go this far. Andre shook his head, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. So, you've been watching everyone? All this time? Did you even realize how wrong this was? Brian's shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth finally hitting him. No, I didn't. I was just bored, and then I saw how easy it was to get into the cameras. But it's not what you think. I never meant to hurt anyone. I didn't know it would lead to all of this. The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed the revelation. Andre felt a surge of disgust. Brian had been the one behind it all. All this time, Andre had been caught in the middle of Brian's reckless experiments, his life turned upside down because of something so unnecessary. And Jessica, she was his wife, yet she had no idea what had been happening in their own home. Officer Collins stepped forward, his tone cold. Mr. Harris, you're going to have to come with us. This is a serious crime, and you'll need to answer for your actions. Unauthorized access to private surveillance feeds is illegal. You'll be facing charges. Jessica gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Brian, no. Brian turned to Jessica, his eyes filled with regret. I never wanted this. I swear, I never meant for things to get this bad. Officer Collins motioned for his colleagues to escort Brian. You need to come with us. We have more questions. As Brian was led out of the room, Andre stood frozen, still processing what had just been revealed. Jessica remained seated at the table, her face pale, as she stared at the spot where Brian had been standing just moments before. This is all my fault, Jessica whispered, her voice broken. I didn't see it. I didn't know. Andre didn't know what to say. What could he say? The truth had come crashing down like a freight train, and now the consequences were starting to unfold. The neighborhood was never going to be the same, and neither were they. The house felt strangely empty after Brian was taken away. The officers, having completed their initial questioning, had left too, leaving Andre and Jessica in the aftermath of the revelation. Andre couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. The gravity of it all was settling in slowly, and each moment felt like it was stretching out longer than it should have. He couldn't believe it. Brian, Jessica's own husband, had been behind the entire mess. Watching people's private security feeds, playing around with their lives without any real regard for the consequences. Andre felt anger boiling in his chest, a deep, seething frustration that had no easy outlet. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation from Brian, but what good would that do now? The damage had been done. The trust that had once existed between him and Jessica seemed shattered, and he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. Not after what Brian had done. Not after everything. Jessica, on the other hand, was a ghost. She hadn't spoken a word since the officers left, and Andre couldn't bring himself to say anything to her. What could he say? They were both trapped in the ruins of a situation neither of them had ever expected. Jessica's eyes were distant as she sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was staring at nothing in particular, her gaze unfocused. Andre's gaze lingered on her, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. He didn't want to be angry at her, but it was hard not to feel betrayed. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that something was wrong. And now, it was all coming down to this, her husband's secret, his reckless behavior, and the mess they'd all found themselves in. "I didn't know, Andre. I didn't know," Jessica said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. She looked up at him, and the pain in her eyes was clear. "I had no idea. I never thought Brian would do something like this." Andre's mouth felt dry as he tried to find the right words. But the truth was, he couldn't find anything to say that would make it better. Nothing would undo the damage. "I know," he said quietly. "But you had your suspicions, Jessica. You called the cops on me. You accused me of something I didn't do." Jessica flinched at his words, her face flushing. "I know," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have asked you first. But I was scared, Andre. I thought I saw something I couldn't explain." Andre's heart softened just a little at her words. He could see the guilt on her face, the way she was blaming herself, even though it wasn't entirely her fault. But how could he not feel betrayed? How could he forget how she'd called the police and turned his life upside down without a second thought? "I just don't get it," Andre said, his voice quieter now. "How could Brian do something like that? How could he watch people's lives like they were just a game? I thought I was getting to know him. I thought I could trust him." Jessica's lips trembled as she looked down at the table. "He's always been so secretive, always hiding things. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. I didn't know he was capable of something like this." The silence hung between them for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Jessica said, "I'm afraid, Andre. I'm afraid of what's going to happen now. What will the neighborhood think of us? What will they think of me? Brian's actions, they're going to change everything." Andre didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know what to say to make it better, to make any of this feel okay. The damage had already been done, and he wasn't sure they could repair what had been broken. He couldn't erase the mistrust, the suspicions that had been planted. And he couldn't forget how he'd been accused, how he'd been caught up in something that wasn't even his fault. The sound of the doorbell ringing once again broke the heavy silence, pulling Andre from his thoughts. He looked at Jessica, his eyes questioning. She wiped at her eyes, a shaky breath escaping her lips. Neither of them moved to answer the door. With a sigh, Andre stood up and walked slowly to the door. He wasn't sure who it could be, perhaps another officer with more questions, or maybe someone from the neighborhood coming to check in. When he opened the door, he was met with a face he hadn't expected to see. It was one of his neighbors, a middle-aged man who lived 2 doors down, and he had an expression on his face that made Andre uneasy. "Mr. Wells," the man said, his voice stiff, "I need to talk to you." Andre stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't in the mood for any more confrontation, not after everything that had just happened. But the man stepped past him into the house, his gaze darting over to where Jessica was sitting. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wells?" the man asked, his tone still formal, but there was a certain coldness to it. "We've heard about the situation with the security cameras. We've all been talking about it. People are concerned." Andre clenched his jaw, trying to maintain his composure. "Everything's fine. We're dealing with it," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The man looked around the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on Jessica before he turned back to Andre. "Well, I hope it's resolved soon," he said stiffly. "Because if not, things could get complicated." The words were vague, but the threat in his tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just about the police investigation anymore. The neighborhood was watching, and Andre could feel the pressure mounting. He was already an outsider, and now he was tangled up in something that could change everything. As the neighbor left, Andre stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The neighborhood had already started to talk. They were already beginning to judge. And Andre couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same again. He turned back to Jessica, who was still sitting at the table, her head in her hands. The look on her face was one of defeat, and for the first time, Andre realized that she wasn't just ashamed of what Brian had done. She was afraid of what the future would hold for them, for their marriage, for their place in the neighborhood. The fallout had begun, and there was no turning back. The days following Brian's arrest were filled with an uncomfortable silence that clung to the neighborhood like a thick fog. Andre couldn't shake the sense of unease that followed him wherever he went. It wasn't just the police investigation or the revelation about Brian's actions. It was the way people were looking at him now, as if he were somehow involved in everything. He could feel their eyes on him whenever he stepped outside, the whispers in the air growing louder with each passing day. Jessica, for her part, was no better off. She had withdrawn completely, no longer the confident woman he had met when he first moved to the neighborhood. She spent most of her time at home, hiding behind the wall she had once been so proud of. Her once warm smile had turned into a forced expression, and Andre couldn't help but feel guilty, knowing that she was suffering under the weight of everything. It was late one afternoon when Andre finally decided to break the silence. He walked into the kitchen where Jessica was seated, her eyes red from crying, her hands absently stirring a cup of coffee. The guilt on her face was unbearable to watch. "Jessica, we need to talk," Andre said quietly, his voice low. "I know this has been hard. For both of us. But I need you to hear me out." Jessica didn't look up at first, but after a moment, she met his gaze. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, an acknowledgement that the time for avoiding the truth was over. "I know, Andre," she whispered, wiping a tear away. "I've been a mess, and I don't even know how to fix it." "How do you fix something like this?" Andre took a deep breath, walking over to the table and sitting across from her. "We start by being honest with each other. About everything. No more hiding. No more secrets." Jessica's eyes welled up again, but she didn't speak. Andre reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "I don't blame you for what happened. I'm angry, yes. But it's not just about you. It's about what's been going on in this neighborhood. What we've been ignoring for too long." Jessica looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Andre said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that all of us, including me, have been living in our own little bubbles. We've been so focused on our own lives, so focused on our own issues, that we've forgotten how important trust and communication are. And when we stop talking to each other, when we stop trusting the people we live next to, things like what happened with Brian, they happen." Jessica's eyes filled with understanding. She nodded slowly. "I see it now. I was so quick to judge. I should have talked to you. I should have listened to what you had to say, instead of jumping to conclusions." Andre squeezed her hand gently. "It's not about blame, Jessica. We both made mistakes. But now we need to learn from them." There was a long pause, the weight of everything still hanging heavily in the air. Jessica's voice broke the silence again. "Do you think we can fix this, Andre? Can we fix what's happened? I don't know if I can ever forgive myself." Andre looked into her eyes, the raw vulnerability in her gaze making his heart ache. "I don't know what the future holds. I can't promise it will be easy. But I do know that we can try. We can rebuild. But it's going to take time. And trust." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock in the background. Outside, the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. The fallout from Brian's actions had rippled through everyone, and no one seemed unaffected by it. The neighbors who had once been so friendly now avoided eye contact when they passed each other on the street. The sense of community had dissolved, replaced by an awkward distance. Jessica stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I need to make this right. I need to fix things with the neighbors. I need to show them that we're not like Brian." Andre stood as well, walking over to her. "We'll do it together. One step at a time. We can't undo the past, but we can shape the future. And I think the first step is facing the people we've wronged, starting with our neighbors." Jessica nodded, and for the first time in days, Andre saw a small flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that things could eventually get better. Later that day, Jessica made the first move. She called the neighbors, the ones who had been whispering behind their backs, and invited them over for coffee. Andre was skeptical, but he knew it was a step in the right direction. The process of rebuilding wouldn't be fast, but they had to start somewhere. Rebuilding trust, relationships, it all took time. And Jessica, despite everything, was willing to try. The next few weeks were tough. There were long conversations with neighbors who were reluctant to speak to them, awkward silences, and uncomfortable meetings. But slowly, things began to change. Some neighbors opened up, admitting their own mistakes and judging Andre and Jessica too quickly. Others, however, remained distant, unwilling to forgive or forget. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Andre and Jessica were learning to trust each other again. They were learning to listen. And that, for Andre, was a victory in itself. In the end, what happened with Brian wasn't just about the breach of privacy or the criminal actions he had taken. It was about the lessons learned, the lessons that Andre and Jessica, along with their neighbors, would carry forward. Life wasn't going to go back to the way it was. Things had changed. But maybe, just maybe, it could be better this way. Maybe, with time, they could rebuild what had been lost. And for the first time since the whole mess began, Andre allowed himself to believe that things could get better. One step at a time.